Hi, I'm Marshall from Freight Companies Australia, and I'd like you to join me in a little bit of a lesson on how freight works in Australia, the what, the how, the where, the who, and the why, and hopefully give you a bit of a background on some of the pitfalls and challenges that we have in the Australian freight industry. So let's start with the basics. So first off, what are we carrying when we're talking about freight in Australia? A lot of time you'll hear talk about a pallet. So a pallet, very basically, is a piece of wood that freight can be put upon. In Australia, when we talk about pallets, we're usually talking about a standard pallet size, which is 116 centimetres by 116 centimetres. Might be referred to as a CHEP or a Loscam pallet or a standard pallet. When you hear people talk about spaces, that's what they usually mean, a pallet space. And if you look at all the different vehicle sizes that will move, often we're looking at how many pallets can we fit in that vehicle. Also made of wood, but of varying sizes, is a skid. A skid can be something really, really small, 60 centimetres by 60 centimetres, that's just carrying nuts and bolts. Or it could be something really long that might be carrying piping or lengths of timber, something like that. Skids can be of all different sizes. So when you talk about pallets, you know the size you're talking about. When you talk about skids, you could be talking about a different size. In addition to that, we have the basic items, which are cartons, parcels, and boxes. These are just items that can be of varying sizes, but typically something that one or two people can lift. So it might be a bike, it might be some A4 paper, it might be something quite anywhere in between. A lot of carriers will charge by carton, parcel, box, but we'll come to that a little bit later. And the final thing people talk about is a satchel bag, jiffy bag. Basically something made of plastic or paper, might be padded, might have some bubble wrap in it, but something that's flexible rather than being something rigid like a carton is. So basic terminology we use in Australia, DIFOT is the key performance indicator for freight. It means delivery in full on time. This is how you judge your carriers, whether they're doing a good job. DIFOT is critical, and it can be the difference between you having a successful business and having customers yelling at you. Cubic essentially is we talk about how much something weighs and we charge by that, or we talk about how much space it takes up. So we need to be really careful if you're sending light freight that the cubic factor, which might be 167 kilos per cubic metre, or it might be 333, need to know what that is because it can make a significant difference in your costing. General and express, so when it gets there, general service, we'll get it there as soon as we can, express service. They're the two typical service levels you might see. Basically, if it's general, don't bother calling the carrier and asking where it is. It'll get there when it gets there. Finally, B2B, B2C, H2H. So these are different markets, essentially. B2B is your business to business, your industrials, delivery from a warehouse to a retailer, delivery of food to a restaurant, B2B. B2C is e-commerce or delivery to consumer, business to consumer deliveries. So a lot of home deliveries, e-commerce type. And H2H can be both. H2H is usually where a delivery requires something special. So it might be if a fridge is being delivered to a home, instead of just leaving the fridge at the front door, the installation team might actually bring the fridge into the house, plug it in, install it, get it working, and remove the other fridge. Typically an H2H style delivery. Let's talk about the challenges in Australia. First thing is Australia is really big. This is Australia compared to the size of New Zealand, for example. 25 million people spread across the country, and we'll get to that in a second, but some of the distances are immense. So it takes 2 or 3 days of non-stop driving to get from point A to point B in Australia. So when you're looking at why deliveries, why do they take so long when it's so much quicker in Europe, for example, that's because we're pretty spread out. Here's sort of an overlay with the US. So you can see that a journey from Brisbane to Perth is pretty much the same as going from Washington to LA. If you're in the US. The challenge in Australia is massive population concentration on that East Coast, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne. A few million people in Adelaide, a few million people in Perth. So you've got the people concentrated in the cities, but a lot of the wealth of Australia is actually in the country. First off, there's the beautiful nature and landscapes. The second thing is mining and agriculture. Massive mining operations in West Australia and Queensland, massive ag operations as well, even in South Australia, even in regional New South Wales. So oftentimes when you're looking at transport companies to use, it really depends on what your market is. So are you better off having someone who can do the East Coast really well, or are you better off looking at someone who can do the mining and the ag? So when we're getting freight around Australia, there's 4 basic modes that we use. The first is a local courier. And a local courier could be a guy with a van, just doing deliveries, point-to-point deliveries, really quick deliveries, or it could be overnight delivery from one suburb of Melbourne to another suburb of Melbourne. Sometimes even there's a same-day option with that as well. Oftentimes last mile deliveries might be in that as well. Road, exactly what it talks about. So a truck comes and picks it up from one point, takes it to a depot. At the depot, they then load that freight onto a bigger truck, which will then run somewhere else. It could be interstate or to another major centre within the state. Road. Most freight travels road in Australia. So that's the primary way of getting freight around. A level up from that is the overnight deliveries. Don't call it air because it might not fly. Overnight delivery typically is we're going to pick it up today and we're going to get it next day into a lot of Australia. Overnight delivery can sometimes be 2 days if it's going to a remote location or if it's coming from a remote location. That's your most expensive way of sending freight. And then you've got rail freight. So the rail network in Australia probably needs some work, but typically, especially East Coast to Perth, vice versa, a lot of freight travels on rail because it's a long way. And you might also have some going up the East Coast as well, but not typically between Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne and Sydney. Typically, it might be Melbourne to Brisbane or even further up. Rates. So this is where it gets a bit interesting. So every transport company can charge however they want. So it's up to them to decide. Everything that we do pretty much comes back to that. We've got to pay people to do the work. So whatever methodology is charging, somewhere someone is doing some maths that says people have got to earn $35-40 an hour doing deliveries, stacking shelves, sorting freight. So the ways of charging can be per hour. So you might see that if you're booking a semi, it might be $85 an hour to do that, or it might be $35 for a 1-ton van. Be careful with the per hours that the methodology the company is using, because it might be depot to depot, or it might be point to point, or it might be return. So even though it might be a 45-minute trip, you might actually get charged 2.5 hours. Just got to look at the small print before you're using that courier company. Con and kilo, consignment and kilo, or basic and kilo rate. So what happens is I'm sending 3 cartons for 30 kilos from Melbourne to Sydney. The transport company might charge me $8 basic charge and then 27 cents per kilo on top of that. So really simple maths. There can be some other things thrown in there, but I'll come to convoluted in a minute. The other way of charging typically is per item. So we talked before about pallets, might be per pallet, might be per carton, might be per satchel. What usually happens though is every company that charges per item has a standard size, and everything over that standard size, even if it's one item, might get charged more. So for example, your company might be saying, okay, if it's 20 kilos, that's a carton, but if it's 22 kilos, it's actually 2 cartons. So you just have to be aware of the charging methodology. And I've thrown convoluted in here as well. So first off, you can have some really weird ways of charging, and I won't go into those now. But if you're sending something different, you can get charged per space. You might get charged, even though your item might only be 1.7 meters high. If it's uncrated machinery, the carrier might actually charge you as if it was 2.4 meters high because they can't put anything on top of it. And there's also minimum charges and a whole bunch of other charges thrown in there. So mostly it's pretty easy, but it can be that 10 or 20% that isn't that might catch you out. Hidden surcharges, so the tricks and traps. Transport companies, 80% of everything is pretty simple and very straightforward, but there's always going to be reasons why extra work or different things have to be charged differently. Fuel surcharge is an interesting one. It was introduced about 20 years ago and never seems to have gone away. Fuel is expensive. Everyone knows fuel is expensive. But what you're seeing now is transport companies charging this variable fuel levy. They might have one this month and it might go up 2% next month based on the average price of fuel from diesel from a gate somewhere. Or it might be based on another factor to do with Singapore sweet light crude. There's a whole bunch of different rules around that. Some carriers will charge different fuel surcharges depending on the mode that you're sending via. So a rail, a road, or an air might be different, or an intra-city might be different. And not everyone charges it. Just something to look out for, especially if you're comparing it, because the fuel surcharge can be the difference between company A or company B getting it. If one company is 13% and one company is 18%, you've got to factor that in. Minimum charges are another trap. When you're sending something small, the company might charge you $15 regardless of how much it weighs. If it's only sort of 1 or 2 kilos, it can also happen with pallets or with bulk carriers. And sometimes the minimum charges can be really high. It might be $300 or $400 minimum charge. So again, the rate might be quite cheap, but once you build the minimum charge or you put that on top, you can be easily caught out. We get into tricky stuff then, so residential or remote or a redelivery surcharges. Depending on who the company is and what they're good at, they just charge extra for stuff they're not good at. Remote's interesting because remote is different things to different carriers, and residential's pretty straightforward. Redelivery is one that sort of does catch people out. So if a company attempts to do a delivery and they're unable to do the delivery through no fault of their own, for example, if a company is shut when they're supposed to be open, they're going to charge the sender for that. That's going to charge. And it's hard. You cannot anticipate that. So this is where you might get a whack 2 weeks later on your bill. It might be another $50 charge for a redelivery charge. And really, redelivery is just the carrier recovering their costs from having to go and do something twice. And the final thing you'll see is the extra work. So hand unload. So if the driver actually has to take items off a pallet because there's no forklift at the receiving end, or waiting time. So also known as demurrage. So typically a company will say, listen, if we've got to wait 15 minutes, we're okay with that. But once it gets to 15 minutes, we might charge you $35 per 15 minutes on top of that. Particularly with your container work, that can sometimes demurrage can actually be more than the job it was. If a truck was booked for 9 o'clock, but the driver turns up and there's 2 trucks in front of them in the queue, well, they're going to charge someone for the fact that now that driver and that truck can't do other work. They've got to stay in the queue, so you're going to pay for it. Let's talk a little bit about the Australian market for transport companies. Typically, people look at the sort of the bigger brand names that for an express market that will cover the whole country. I'm going to focus on express today because a lot of the customers we talk to focus in this market as well. So the biggest one is the Australia Post network. So Australia Post is a government-owned corporation that can deliver pretty much everywhere. Everywhere there's a post office, they have an obligation to deliver everywhere in the country. Australia Post is usually the default for e-commerce, but we'll come to that later on. StarTrack is a wholly owned subsidiary of Australia Post that provides pretty much the same service, but just a little bit quicker, and is also a little bit more flexible in the freight they can pick up and deliver. Both StarTrack and Australia Post love e-commerce and can do other stuff. The Toll Group, depending on when you're seeing this, the Toll Group may or may not still be owned by private equity, or it may be still being broken up. Short story long, they got bought by Japan Post 7 or 8 years ago for about $5 billion. It didn't go so well afterwards and now been broken up and sold. Some divisions of Toll can do a lot. Some divisions of Toll can't. It's a big beast. And the final sort of biggest one is FedEx, which used to be called TNT until recent acquisition. Really good in the industrials, not so good in the home deliveries. But again, good reach. So those 3 carriers have a pretty big regional network as well. So you know that if you're sending something in one of those, it's not being handed off until much later in the piece. Your next 2 ones people talk about a lot are Couriers Please and Aramex. Aramex, formerly known as Fastway. Couriers Please, currently owned by Singapore Post. Huge in the B2C market. They love e-commerce, and probably the biggest 2 contenders or opposition to Australia Post and StarTrack in that. Good companies, both run a really interesting franchise operation. So your local driver typically owns the area that he's in. I say he, mostly men. And so you can get really good service out of them because if you want to work with a local agent, they see genuine value in looking after you. Not always, but most often they're pretty good. And then there's everyone else. There's probably another 15,000 transport companies. Typically, once you move out of these four, you move into more regional specialists, a lot of bulk specialists, a lot of general carriers, rail carriers. There's a lot out there. So what are some of our challenges in sending freight in Australia? The first thing we've talked about is the distance. It's just a big country. It takes a long time to drive anywhere. So that can cause issues, especially if you're doing fresh, if you're doing food, if you're doing something that needs to survive the journey. Also, if you're doing fragile, because it's going to rumble a lot on the road or on the rail as it goes where it's going. So packaging becomes quite important then. The second challenge is a population spread, which we talked about before. So again, that sort of Gold Coast or sort of Brisbane down to Melbourne corridor where a lot of people live, then Adelaide, then Perth, and then not a lot of people in the middle. But conversely, they have congestion because so many people live in the city. Traffic is horrible, particularly Melbourne and Sydney are not fun to drive in. So it can cause a lot of issues with local deliveries and trucks just getting stuck in traffic. Safety is a huge challenge for us. Too many drivers die every year, largely due to fatigue and safety issues. There are a raft of changes that have come in to try and fix that, including something called chain of responsibility, which basically means it's everyone's responsibility to ensure the safety of the driver at all times. So we have to make sure drivers aren't tired. We have to make sure that they haven't been, they're looking after themselves from their health point of view, and the vehicles are safe. Really, it should be all our prime consideration to ensure the safety of everyone. Insurance can be a challenge. Some companies offer it, some companies don't offer it, some companies include it in the rate, some companies include it in the rate but hide that fact. It can be a minefield, and often what happens is people just don't bother with it, which means that essentially then the carriers can often fall back on the common carrier clause, which essentially means that we're sorry something bad happened, but we're not responsible. Bad luck. Good luck next time. The final challenge as companies who want to send freight is obfuscation. And what happens here is it's really hard to compare two different transport companies. You look at a postcode and think, oh, that should be uniform, but what some people consider to be metropolitan Melbourne and others consider to be regional Victoria can change. And that can make it really, really hard to compare the two. So that's when we start to rely really heavily on the technology or on freight managers like us to do the hard thinking for you. So some of the pitfalls we see when companies launch or companies do business in Australia from a freight point of view. The first thing, particularly in e-commerce, is they put the blinkers on and go straight for Australia Post and Star Trek. Australia Post and Star Trek do freight well, but they're also constantly running at capacity, by some reports currently at 140% capacity. And unless you're a big customer, they just don't care. And because they can't care, because they are too big, they have too many customers. The other challenge with Australia Post and Star Trek is if the driver doesn't deliver, that's going to go to the local post office, which can really annoy your consumers. When, especially with social distancing, they can find themselves out in the weather for 15 or 20 minutes just to get into the post office, just to collect an item that should have been delivered to their home. The second challenge or pitfall that we see people going through is because there's so much choice, they don't avail themselves of that choice. So they might just go, okay, we're going to send all their freight with company one and not worry about using any other companies. And no company is great at everything. And typically we need to find the pockets of excellence and choose the carriers that can do things best, which then leads some companies, when they try and do that, to end up with too many options. So, 5 transport companies or 4 transport companies might be 98%, but they might then put 3 or 4 in to cover that last 2. There's a few things that can happen here. One is your dispatch managers are going to hate you because you're just making their life really, really hard with all these different companies coming in. The second thing is you can dilute your buying power because you've just got too many companies coming in. You're not spending enough money with all of them. So you try and find a balance between the best solution, which can be a combination of rate, it can be a combination of geographic spread and capability, and also not having too many carriers in there. The second pitfall is, like every other Western country, we get really busy at Christmas. Define Christmas for me. Some companies you talk to say Christmas starts in September. Then there might be some special deals going through and things might get busier through the year. Even if you're not in B2C, if you're not looking after consumers, Christmas can still cause your transport companies to get hammered, which means that your deliveries will also be delayed into that. So it's important to plan and try and perhaps stage freight into state or get freight moving earlier to beat that Christmas crunch. You also see spikes around Easter for no reason whatsoever. And you also see spikes at Mother's Day. It's probably the biggest one. And in some industries, end of financial year, perhaps the medical hospitals and things spending all their money before the end of financial year. Also that whole, I've got to go and buy another printer because it's nearly tax time. The final pitfall is overspending based on the perceptions. So this is using the brand names and thinking that to get the great service and the great technology, we've got to go with the brand names. There are a lot of companies now that might not have the name and might not have the presence in your mind, but deliver a sensational service with technology not much different to what the big names are using. And so we really need to look at those other carriers and not pay the premiums that some of the big carriers charge. And finally, what do we do? So Freight Companies Australia is a freight management company. So we are not a transport company, but where our customers come to us and say, we need to distribute these things. Can you put together a solution for us? We're fully independent, which means that we'll use any transport company in Australia. It's just about choosing the pockets of excellence, like I said before, and getting the right carriers at the right time for the right price. We don't charge a margin on that freight. There's no obfuscation with our rates. We charge a fee that's been agreed between us and the sender to make sure that everyone's happy with the services we provide. We put a huge focus on technology to do the heavy lifting. So software to help with dispatch, software to help with the invoice fitting, to make sure things happen as quickly and as easily, and also as cheaply as possible. And in addition to that, we've launched Australia Distribution, which is a warehousing and logistics provider for companies that want to launch in Australia. So our customers might be a New Zealand exporter that doesn't have exactly the critical mass to get into one of the big players, but might need to get a couple of cubic meters of freight over here to test the market. That's where we come in. And we offer endless aisle visibility and full service, including returns, repairs, customer service, and also sales support for our customers. So thanks very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative. You can find out more about us at freightcompaniesaustralia.com.au.